Hello, and welcome to The Mastering Show. My name is Ian Shepherd. I'm a mastering engineer, and I run a website called Production Advice, where I aim to help you get the best results recording, mixing, and mastering your music. And with me again this week is my co-host John Tidy from reaperblog.net. John, I believe you're struggling to stay awake.
I am, but I'm super excited about this topic. Sure am.
How excited are you, John? You're bursting with excitement. You're overflowing with excitement. Your cup runneth over. Yes. Okay. So what is the topic that has John positively foaming at the mouth with anticipation? We're going to talk about gain staging, which it's a pretty nerdy topic. So if you hate the nerdy episodes, listen anyway, because you'll learn something.
There have been many 1,000-post comment threads about this topic already this week. So, yeah. I mean, that's why this is the topic this week. Is just that, I've been participating in multiple threads on Facebook about whether gain staging matters or not when you're working in a digital audio workstation. And why, and what the best way to kind of inform people about this is. I wanted to do an episode talking about floating point anyway, and this topic is very closely related to that topic. And I just think there's probably plenty of people listening to this who will find this helpful. And so it would be good to talk about it while it's fresh in my mind. It's in the zeitgeist.
Will it still be in the zeitgeist next week when this episode hits the internet, though?
No,
that's the question.
They'll be outraged about something else. I'm sure.
I know, and we'll be old news, and that's so lame. But anyway.
Should we give our stance on this so that people can just shut off if they disagree at the beginning?
You think we should just put our cards on the table and say what we think, yeah?
Yeah, let's do that. I say it does matter.
Yeah, I say it does matter.
All right.
But we should probably take some time saying why people, because there is a valid argument for saying that it doesn't matter.
But that's what this show is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. But before we do any of that, we need to say that because there are some people out there who go, what is gain staging anyway? So
okay.
What do you understand by the term of gain staging?
Gain staging to me is making sure that each component in the signal chain is at the optimum level, making sure that if we're starting off with a microphone, like that instrument is loud enough over, we're not recording something that's super quiet that can be actually louder. Going into the microphone, an appropriate amount of gain is being applied to that. If it's going into a compressor, it's not over compressing or adding noise at that point. It's not clipping the converter. It's not going too low into the computer. And then any sort of processing inside the computer is appropriate. Well, it's unlikely that you're doing things accidentally that would be terribly destructive to it once you're inside the computer. But basically, it's just making sure that each component is not adding noise and it's not creating distortion or clipping at each point in the chain. There's also like impedance issues when you're talking about analog, but that's besides the point. I
think in terms of the general topic, it's kind of on point because, gain staging was absolutely critical when you used to work in analog. So you mentioned the mic, and you're absolutely right. You need the signal to be loud enough that you're not getting hiss, particularly in the early days when the mics weren't as sensitive. And you had valve technology or tube mics and that kind of stuff. But you don't want it to be distorting at the mic or the preamp. You don't want it to be distorting anywhere inside the mixing desk. If you're recording it to tape, you want the signal to be hot enough that there's plenty of space between the signal and the noise floor, but not distorting, or at least not distorting any more than you might want, because people like using tape to get that kind of soft saturation sound. So you might want to be rounding off some transients by recording to tape. And then you play it back from tape and it comes back through the mixing desk. And then, it's got to go through all these compressors. Every stage in the chain, every piece of analog gear has its own inherent noise, depending on how it works, the quality of the components, all the rest of it. And they would all distort if you pushed them too hard. So it was absolutely drilled into engineers who worked in analog that this was absolutely crucial. And lots of those guys transitioning into using digital have brought all of those best practices with them and use them in digital. And I think that's where this whole online debate comes in, because there's lots of people saying that that's not necessary. And you said yourself there that kind of any digital processing is appropriate. So I guess we should take a minute to explain briefly why people are saying it doesn't matter in the digital environment, because you might think, well, you still have to stop the signal clipping, and you don't want it to record too quietly, right? Because even though it's a digital system and you've got much more signal to noise ratio, you still have the kind of the top of the digital scale where things will clip and distort, and you still have the bottom of the scale where you have noise, either analog noise from the recording or dither noise or whatever it might be. The answer to why it doesn't really matter is this thing called floating point processing. So if you think about forget about floating point for a minute. If you just think about a 16-bit audio signal, you've got 16 bits, each of them stores a 0 or a 1. I forget what the exact number is, but it's something like there are 65,000 different values that 16-bit number can take. So in a kind of crude, simplistic fashion, when you're sampling the analog signal to get that digital audio signal, any volume, any voltage in the original signal is being assigned one of those 65,000 values on the digital scale. Now, of course, anybody who's listened to the dither episode, is there going to be an episode of this where we don't mention the dither episode? Will know that actually it's not that simple. You can actually effectively store numbers in between those 65,000 levels by sacrificing a little bit of the signal to noise ratio by adding dither. Anybody who hasn't listened to the dither episode yet is going to have to go and listen to it now. But what I'm interested in terms of this discussion is thinking about the maximum level. If you think about all of those 16 bits being on some really loud signal right up at the top of the digital scale, so the peak levels are right up there, just kissing 0 the entire time. Basically, if you add any amount of gain to that signal, it's going to be a number that the digital system can't store, right? If I forget what the actual number is, but if you're up there at 65,000 and you add another 1,000 so that it's 66,000, the digital system is going to say, well, I can't store 66,000 as a number. And that's the limitation of a fixed point digital system. Floating point is where you allocate an extra 8 bits to something called the exponent, which is a multiplier. And actually, the floating point format we're most familiar with is 32-bit floating point, which consists of a 24-bit fixed point number and an 8-bit exponent, this multiplier. So the way that it works is, imagine that the 24-bit part of the signal is storing the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, of course, in the real world, these numbers are stored in binary, but if I try and explain it in binary, nobody will ever understand it. So just for simplicity, let's imagine that the exponent is in base 10, right? Decimal, the way we normally count numbers. So the exponent goes in powers of 10, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, and so on. So you have 10 to the power of 1 is 1, 10 to the power of 2, 10 squared is 100, 10 to the power of 3, 10 cubed is 1,000, 10 to the power of 4 is 10,000, and all the rest of it. So you take your original number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you multiply it by whatever the exponent is. So let's say the exponent was 2, that's 10 to the power of 2, which is 200. So the computer basically assumes that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is 1.2345, and it multiplies it by 10 to the power of 2, which is 100. So you have 123.45. Whereas if the exponent was 1, it would multiply it by 10 to the power of 1, which is by 10. So it would be 12.345. So the exponent moves the decimal point effectively and allows you to store much bigger numbers. If the exponent was 9, that's multiplying by 1 billion. So you'd have 1,234,500,000 would be your number. So you can immediately see suddenly you're not limited to what the fixed point number was, by introducing the possibility of having this exponent, this multiplier, you can store absolutely vast numbers. I can't remember what the actual figures are, but I think even in binary, which is how these numbers are actually stored, not powers of 10 as I've been using in my example, you can easily add 1,000 dBs of gain if you're storing it as a floating point number, even if the original fixed point number, the original 24-bit number, was already maxed out. That's the power and the point of a floating point, is that suddenly you don't have to worry about these limitations of a fixed point number. And the other interesting thing is that you can also divide by that exponent. So you could divide by 10, divide by 100, divide by 1,000. And that means that you can store absolutely tiny numbers as well. You could apply minus 1,000 dBs of gain in the digital environment to your original signal level. And then you could boost it back up again. You wouldn't have lost anything. If you turn a real analog signal or a fixed point digital signal down by 1,000 dBs, when you turn it back up again, you'll either get nothing or just hiss. But when you have a floating point number, you can basically manipulate the gain of it in any way that you like. And it's fairly easy to understand from that that's why people say that gain structure doesn't matter in digital, because if you can boost or cut the level by 1,000 dBs without any consequences, it doesn't really matter what the signal level was to begin with or what you do with it. How did I do in explaining that?
It made sense to me, but we did have that pre-discussion going into this. And the thing is, floating point only exists inside of the computer. Can't even happen inside your analog to digital converter or your digital to analog converter. So once it gets to either end of your computer, from your microphone to your speaker, it doesn't exist anymore. You're stuck with a fixed point.
Yeah, it's a temporary storage format, isn't it? You can use it to manipulate the numbers, but at the end of the day, you have to play the digital signal back, and at that point, it has to be reduced back into a fixed point number because there are no floating point converters. Right. Analog to digital and digital to analog converters are built from electronic components. You can give them plenty of bits. You can't reconfigure the electronics in real time or anything wild like that.
Right. So I brought up the analog stage of it because there is the option of recording in your DAW at a 32-bit float format. But what you're actually getting is a 24-bit file. You don't get that floating point benefit until you start adding some processing or until you actually render it as a new audio file.
Right. And I think, in fact, that even varies from DAW to DAW. I think Pro Tools, for example, asks you to define the bit depth of the session, and that determines how the signal will be recorded. So if you set the bit depth to be 16-bit, it will only record 16-bit files. Pro Tools nerds will have to correct me if I'm wrong about this. Whereas if you set it to 32-bit floating point, it will then record a 24-bit signal, but it will allow you to perform floating point calculations on that signal. It's a good point. It's a kind of temporary state.
And the mixers inside of a DAW will always perform at 32-bit or 64-bit float. The mixers themselves can't add any noise or add any distortion. They're completely non-destructive. When we're talking about hardware digital mixers, there's some potential for that because of the analog components, usually like on the outputs or on the mic preamps and things like that. Or maybe the effects processors don't use floating point. So maybe it could go in and out of floating point and integer math. That's one of the reasons I would say that the gain staging in digital actually makes a difference. It's very important.
Well, and this is where things start getting interesting because, so I think hopefully we've explained why people say that gain staging doesn't matter. The problem with that is that there are lots of situations, even in a digital audio workstation, where it does matter that you need to know about so that you don't run into trouble. So in the things that you were talking about, one interesting thing is that Pro Tools has only fairly recently gone 32-bit floating point. If you're talking about the HD version, that always used to be 48-bit fixed point. And they did some clever maths with the master fader so that you could record signals that were higher, or create signals that were higher than 0 inside the DAW without causing clipping distortion. But even so, it was still a fixed point system. The other interesting thing that you said there was you said that the mixer can't add distortion and noise, and I would agree with that if they're coded correctly, because another kind of possibility is that there might be some bugs in some of the plugins that we use, especially in the way that they talk to the host DAW. But that's the mixer, or the kind of the audio processing engine of the DAW itself. When you start talking about plugins, actually all bets are off. There are a ton of plugins that deliberately introduce noise and distortion and saturation and all of these kind of effects because they're modeling or emulating analog hardware. So, if you think of any of the UAD plugins that emulate an 1176 or a Fairchild or whatever, if you think about Slate virtual tape machines or the virtual consoles thing, Harrison Mixbus is a DAW that has all of that stuff built in. It tries to make the mixing experience more like using a traditional analog console by having all of these kind of saturation effects on by default. So it's not that those things are not possible in digital. They should only happen deliberately. But I've definitely heard stories about plugins that were poorly coded so that, for example, the exponent part of the 32-bit floating point number would get lost. So your number would get truncated and possibly with the wrong amount of gain applied. All kinds of stuff could, in theory, go wrong because of problems. I think these days we're probably in a situation where that's a fairly small risk, but it's definitely a possibility. You mentioned another situation, which is where if the signal is going out through some hardware, or even in some cases being passed to a different part of the digital system. Another Pro Tools thing is that it used to have accelerator cards in it. Some of the processing was handled by the CPU of the computer, and some of it was handled by the processor card. And you had to be very careful about how the information was passed to the card and back again in terms of the bit depth and all of the rest of it to make sure that nothing went awry there.
And with those old Pro Tools systems, the plugins themselves were 48-bit, so there is a fixed ceiling. There's a maximum amount of volume that those can handle. And if you're clipping one, the next one can't be turned down to remove that clipping. If it was floating point, like most modern DAWs, that is the case, unless, of course, you're using analog modeling plugins and things like that.
Right. And I think there's another issue that I want to kind of raise that you mentioned briefly when you were talking about what gain staging is, which is that a lot of the, especially in the kind of the debates that I've been watching and taking part in on Facebook, most of the discussion has been about, okay, you do need to avoid clipping, you do need to avoid getting too much noise into the signal, but otherwise gain staging is irrelevant in a digital system. Assuming you're aware of the kinds of plugins that you're using and all these issues. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that. All plugins come with presets. And most people use plugins, you start out by bringing the plugin in and you probably flick through the presets to get a starting point somewhere that sounds reasonably good that you can then refine and tweak that. Even when I'm mastering, I have some default settings, and default settings in a plugin are effectively a preset, whether you think of it that way or not. For an EQ, that's fine. Digital EQ, the purely digital, no analog noise modeling or any of the distortion or any of that stuff. It doesn't matter how loud the signal is. The EQ will just do its job. It's what's known as a linear process. But a compressor has a threshold and a ratio. So the way that the compressor reacts to the signal depends on how loud the signal was coming in the first place. So say for the sake of example, if your signal is 10 dBs hotter than the people who set up the preset in the compressor thought it might be, or had when they were setting up the preset, even made them You would hope that they thought about the end user, but I guess that's not a given. When you flick through those presets, you're hearing all of those presets running 10 dBs hotter than they were designed to operate. Now, you can just raise the threshold by 10 dBs, but lots of people, I mean, especially if you haven't got this idea of gain staging in your head, you might not even think to do that. You record a good hot signal in from your mic and your A to D converter. You bring it in, you lift the level up so that it's peaking up nicely into the red, and you add in a plugin. But if that plugin was designed to operate with loudness levels at about, say, -14, -18 LUFS, and you're already up at -4 or -8, none of those presets are going to sound the way that the designers expected you would hear them. So the question in that case is whether the user would ever hear a clean signal. You could even imagine if 20 dBs of gain was added. I mean, it's a fairly extreme example, but it might not even be possible to raise the threshold of the compressor high enough to stop gain reduction happening. So you would always hear the compressor working with gain reduction. And if it's an analog emulating plugin that has some of that saturation and distortion stuff built in that overdrives in the way that an analog compressor might do, again, the person using it is never going to hear that the way that the person who designed it intended it to. Now, there are people who say, doesn't matter if you like the sound of it, it's all good. But I think, for me personally, I like to start off with any type of processor using it the way it's intended to be used. And then once I'm kind of comfortable with the basic operating of it, then I start to push it to the extremes and listen to what it does when you start to break the rules, if you like. I think that's a far from ideal situation if somebody isn't hearing the gear or the plugins that they're using in the way that they were intended. And it also depends on the order that the processing happens in. So there's a huge difference between adding a soft clipping process before you run a signal through a compressor as there is to adding it after you run it through the compressor. And if you don't have, so just for example, if the signal is nice and low and is not really doing any clipping, then you'll hardly hear the effects of the clipper and the compressor will react one way. But if actually there's an extra 10 dBs of gain going in there because you haven't gain staged it, there'll be quite heavy amounts of, or could be quite heavy amounts of clipping taking place, which will change the sound quite dramatically before it hits the compressor, will change the way that the compressor reacts, and dramatically affect the sound. So I think, again, that's another situation where I think that gain staging absolutely does matter in a digital environment. It's a digital environment where decisions have been made to not have it operate in the floating point way that it's capable of. But that's a really valid situation and a really common situation. There's a ton of plugins that work that way.
Several times in there, you mentioned using them the way they're intended. But there are also situations where you get great results by using them in a way that they're not intended. So let's say the SSL bus compressor, if you hit that with a really hard signal and it's constantly pinned, that can sound really amazing on drums. Or for parallel compression, like you mentioned it last week, if you're a Beatles fan, there are all these techniques that were invented by doing it the wrong way, ignoring the instruction manual and things like that, not operating in the sweet spot of that piece of gear. In a mastering context, one thing that comes to mind is intentionally clipping a hardware converter as part of the signal chain. And respecting gain staging is not going to make that work.
No, I mean, we did a whole episode on clipping for anybody listening to this, which we can include a link to that episode in the show notes on themasteringshow.com if you want to check that out. But we kind of talked about clipping hardware converters in that episode. I don't think it's something that either of us particularly is a fan of, but you're absolutely right. And yeah, as we said last week, just talking about, in that whole discussion about does it matter if you can or can't hear it, and is it okay to break the rules? I absolutely think it is valid to break the rules. And if you intentionally break the rules and create a sound that you like, that's good. That's fine, because you've knowingly done something, had an effect that is unexpected, and chosen to go along with it. For people to say that gain staging doesn't matter, technically that's accurate, but it only doesn't matter if you understand what you're doing and how you're breaking the rules. Because imagine the other situation where somebody who isn't thinking about gain staging, or maybe even doesn't know about gain staging, comes in and accidentally starts breaking those rules and gets a sound that actually they're not that keen on, but they don't think they can get any other result because they don't realize rules again is too hard a word, but they're guidelines, right? It's people talk about the nominal operating level of a piece of gear. It's the level that it was intended to operate at when it was designed. It's not like a rule that you have to use it in that way. It's just that's what's recommended.
It's usually the point where there's the lowest noise and the lowest amount of THD, total harmonic distortion.
Yeah, it's another sweet spot. I'm always going on about sweet spots on this show, and it's right. It's finding the perfect balance between having enough headroom and little enough noise and all the rest of it. But again, almost every component in an audio signal chain is designed to do something. And if you're assuming that the signal comes in the sweet spot, everything is going to be set up with that expectation in mind. So yeah, just to take an extreme example, if somebody doesn't realize that you shouldn't typically clip an analog to digital converter unless you're going for a deliberate effect, that used to happen a lot when I first started out. People used to send their masters in on DATs, digital audio tape, which have digital peak meters. And these days, most people know that you shouldn't push a digital peak meter into the red unless you want to go for a hard-clipped digital sound. Back then, people didn't realize that. They were used to analog meters, where it was normal to let the needles peak up into the red. And it was even normal to let the new LED displays that had just kind of come out peak up into the red, because those were designed to behave in the same way as the needles that had gone before them. So people would let DAT machines slam up into the red, and they'd be clipping the hell out of the signal and not realize that the reason it sounded a bit gritty and a bit scratchy and kind of fizzy was because they weren't using it and the way that it was intended. And quite often when you explained this to people, it was a revelation to them that, they were kind of like, oh, right, okay, that's why. And that's what I mean. If you understand how something is meant to work, then you can make an informed choice about whether you're going to use it that way or not. But if you don't understand how it's meant to work, if you don't understand gain staging, you're kind of thrashing around in the dark. If you're lucky, you might get a great result, but you might not. And another thing is a lot of these analog emulating plugins are designed to do that sexy thing that, the Fairchild or whatever it was used to do. People pay money expecting to get that effect without realizing that in order to get the effect that you're going for, that you would have heard back in the 70s or whatever when you were using that piece of kit, you need to use it in a certain way. And if you don't, you're not going to get that effect. You're going to get something completely different, potentially.
We talked about the difference between the VU meters and LED meters, and switching from DAT or from analog to DAT, or any sort of digital recording. They're totally different operating levels, and I think people didn't realize this. I wasn't there, but red on a VU meter is like +4, be -16, I think, in digital.
Yeah, depending how the VU, that's another thing, depending how the VU meter was calibrated. Actually, this reminds me, we should probably not go down the whole tangent of metering, because I've had a couple of requests to do another show about metering, talking specifically about the kind of differences that you're talking about. Whether we can successfully do that on a podcast where you can't have a diagram, I'm not sure, but it's definitely a challenge worth considering accepting. But yeah, even in the analog world, without even introducing the kind of confusion of transitioning from analog to digital, there were different operating levels. There was pro line level that was 4 dBs hotter than consumer line level, for example. Yeah, let's face it, it's audio, right? People make it as complicated as they possibly can.
There's too many standards. Let's standardize this. And then there's one more standard.
Yeah, or let's abolish all the standards and it be complete chaos. You mentioned something specific about mastering a few minutes ago, and I think maybe we should try and wrap this up by bringing this back to mastering. You know, we've been talking very generally about gain staging and digital versus analog and how those things relate, and hopefully we explained it in a way that was helpful or at least intelligible to everybody listening. Okay, so the irony of this is I've been taking part in all of these Facebook discussions over the last week or two and basically saying, yes, I do think gain staging matters, meaning I think it's really important that people understand how it works so that they know when they have to pay attention to it and when they don't in the digital environment. There's even a module in the Home Mastering Masterclass course called Digital Gain Staging and Why It Matters. But actually, most of the time when I'm mastering, I completely ignore it. One of the most common questions I get from people doing the home mastering course is, well, you've put your gain boost right at the beginning of the chain, so all of the plugins are going into the red. Doesn't that matter? And the answer is no, because they're all floating point plugins. None of them are doing analog emulation. So the floating point system can happily record levels that are, or deal with levels that are above 0 dB full scale. And providing I bring everything back into control at the end of the chain, which I usually do with a limiter, everything's fine. So yeah, there I am saying, no, digital gain staging is really, really important. You've got to pay attention to it. And actually myself, I hardly ever do. That's not completely true. There's one situation where, so I like to use the TC Electronic mastering plugins that come with their hardware PowerCore 6000 Firewire unit. That does have floating point in and out, but the actual processing of the plugins is, I think, 48-bit fixed point. So basically, they have a maximum of 12 dBs headroom above 0 when you're going in. So I do pay attention. In fact, I gain stage with those plugins, and I apply the gain boosts carefully, either within a limiter plugin or afterwards or whatever it is, in order to, I deliberately avoid clipping the input to those plugins and also clipping the output from those plugins just to be on the safe side. And of course, if I use something where I want to try and impart a bit of analog flavor, or if I'm actually sending something out to an analog piece of gear or whatever, then again, I pay attention to gain staging. You mentioned just a kind of really straightforward situation where almost anybody in mastering wants to pay attention to gain staging, which was the peak level when you move the material onto the mastering stage. This is another thing that people have been getting upset about on the internet. I've recommended in the past that people leave about 6 dBs of peak headroom when they send their music to be mastered. But of course, that doesn't really matter. It's absolutely fine to have the peak levels go up to 0, providing you're not clipping. The -6 figure is just a rule of thumb to keep people safe, really. And I mean, you were saying you think that things get easier when people do that, when they give you a bit more peak headroom. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. If there's 6 or even 12 dB of headroom, that means that they're probably using less limiting or compression on their master bus when they're doing their mix. And they've probably been more careful throughout the process to not be constantly pushing the master. And I do a lot of mixing, so I know that it's very easy to keep pushing your levels up. The singer's always like, more me, the bass player's like, more me, and the master gets into the red very easily. So I understand. But when you get to mastering, it's nice to be able to have the option of turning things up or down to get the right balances. Not just up, not just down, but somewhere around the like -12 dB FS for peak level or -6, totally cool. That leaves 6 to 12 dB of headroom for me to clip if I choose to, compress if I choose to, limit, all these things without ever seeing the clip lights come on in my DAW. Anytime that where it's just everything slammed, there's no headroom, you can only turn it down. You can't really restore that. Even if they were printed in 32-bit floating point, depending on the processing, you can't remove that. So,
Yeah, the analogy is always with a steak, isn't it? If somebody asks for their steak medium and it comes off of the grill bloody, you can always put it back on for a minute or two more. But once the steak is burned, it's burned. And the same thing applies to audio. You can always add a little bit more compression, a little bit more limiting if you need to bring the level up or whatever. But once it's clipping, once it's saturated, once the compression is in there, it's kind of baked into the sound. And yeah, I agree. We can always turn it down, like you say, and providing no harm has been done before you turn it down, it doesn't actually make, there's no difference if somebody supplies you a signal that's peaking at 0 and you turn it down by 6 dBs, that's no different than them supplying it peaking at -6 to begin with, providing nothing happened in the process of it getting up to that much hotter level in the first place. The reason I like to recommend -6 is that it just encourages people to be more conservative at every previous stage of the chain. It's kind of a shortcut without having to get them to listen to an hour-long podcast on gain staging. If you just recommend, keep your peaks down about -6, chances are they'll have lower peak levels on all of the channel faders, which means that there are lower levels hitting the plugins in the mix, which means that when they all get summed together, the final stereo output is lower. And yeah, there's just less risk of all of those things being overcooked. I kind of made this point in one of the discussions I was taking part in, and I was accused of not trusting people to do things right themselves. It's not that I don't trust people to get it right. It's just that I've seen stuff done wrong so many times. It just seems to me that encouraging best practices is a sensible way to go. I think I've said this on a show before. When you get something that's overcooked, I always ask the client if it's possible to get a version where the levels are more conservative.
That
sometimes
takes
it is
time away from actually doing the work.
Yeah, it holds things up. Usually somebody sent it to you, they need it back to the following day. It can hold things up. It's annoying for them. They kind of feel some kind of degree of criticism from that comment. It's almost always worth doing. Sometimes it's not possible, but in the situations where it is possible, you almost always get a better result. So I think it's much better to encourage people to get that better result themselves earlier on in the chain than have to do it retroactively at the last minute at the mastering stage.
Yeah. Yeah, if you say keep 6 dB of peaks, it's more likely to be a more dynamic mix coming in. But if you don't say anything at all, it's going to be right at 0. Maybe not, but there is a chance of that. And I like that rule of thumb. I'm a fan of that stuff because you can't always say, well, this is how I like it to be done, but to explain it, you need to listen to this hour-long podcast and then check out our episode on Dither and then watch all these videos. They just want to know the number. They don't need your life story. They want to know the number, and that's it.
Exactly. And so for anybody listening who's interested in this and is kind of thinking, well, okay, now I know that gain staging or understanding gain staging is important. What do I do? If you want a rule of thumb or a guideline in terms of gain staging yourself, I would say use your loudness meter to set your loudness levels on each channel of a mix at roughly somewhere between -18, -14 dBs. That probably means you're going to have peaks getting up to -6, -3, those kind of levels. If you do that using a trim plugin or however you choose to do it, and then you start adding plugins in and they emulate analog gear or whatever reason, there's a good chance that they're going to be operating in the expected area and you're going to be good. So that's a good rule of thumb. And it's, again, you get people who kind of go, don't stop telling me rules. Let me, be creative and be free and all the rest of it. It's just a guideline. It's just something that makes everybody's life easier. The great thing about that rule is you can offer it to somebody. There aren't going to be any downsides to that. Somebody can not know anything about gain staging. If they use that rule of thumb, okay, I'll have all my channel faders roughly around -18 as a starting point, and I work from there, -18 LUFS or -18 RMS. If you're using an RMS meter, they're roughly the same thing. If you use that guideline, I don't see a downside to that.
That also puts your track faders right around the unity mark, usually, for mix. So you can go +6 or minus 12, and that's usually enough range. You don't have to have your fader down at the bottom of the range, where it's harder to automate. Yeah. So that's another reason I like to do that in the mix.
Absolutely. And then while you're doing that and getting decent results, you can start learning about gain staging and experimenting with pushing things harder or breaking the rules, and you can do all of that creative stuff. Whereas to come at it from the other angle and just start out saying, you don't need to worry about digital gain staging, you open up the possibility that you're actually going to get a train wreck of a mix where everything is crushed and distorted. You're still going to have to learn gain staging anyway to fix all of those problems, but you're redoing the work. It's just, to me, it's kind of common sense. But, everybody has different opinions about these things, and that's okay. That's what makes things interesting in this wonderful world of recording and mixing and mastering and all the rest of it.
I think using the rule of thumb is probably just as bad as saying don't worry about it at all.
Oh, you mean using the rule of thumb as a kind of, handed to you on stone tablets kind of thing?
You don't trust them to do it right. Like, well, you're telling them not to think about it at all, and that's just as bad.
We should probably get rid of the expression rule of thumb, right? Because it includes the word rule. I think guideline is a much... I'm going to try and start saying guide. I'm always saying rule of thumb. And I think guideline is a much better, or suggestion, because, that's what the recommendation, all of those things, that's what they are. They're suggestions, recommendations, not rules. If somebody out there is going to be supplying their mix to a mastering engineer and it's peaking at -5, don't worry. It's peaking at -4, don't worry. If it's peaking at -3, don't worry. But maybe check that you're not pushing anything too hot elsewhere in the chain before you send it off. And I think...
Is not drinking the water when you're on vacation in Mexico a guideline or a rule?
Very good point. It's a guideline that I broke when I went to Morocco, and I regretted. I had the salad. Well, so it was a guideline that was offered to me, and it's now a rule that I have.
Yeah. I feel that way about mastering.
I agree. And I think in the mastering context, it is important because of, the kind of primary rule of do no harm. I think it'd be really, really hard to do a great job of being a mastering engineer if you didn't understand and pay attention to gain structure, even if you choose to ignore it. That's kind of the position I'm in, right? I understand all of this stuff. I've done gain staging for analog. I've done gain staging for digital. And most of the time, I don't worry about it while I'm mastering because I don't have to. It's just when I pull in the odd plugin or use this or that process or run something out to a piece of analog hardware or whatever it is. And at that point, I know what I need to know to avoid any problems and to get a great result. And that's the goal. So I think the mastering maxim for this week, and apologies to anybody who likes the mastering maxims and missed one last week. Sorry. So the maxim this week would have to be understand gain staging. By all means, understand it and decide it's not relevant to you. By all means, understand it and decide that, yes, you're going to, these were best practices for 20 or 30 years of analog recording. Maybe it's not a good idea to throw them out with the bathwater just because we happen to be using digital hardware. But whichever way you decide, make that decision based on an understanding and then go out and make great recordings and masters.
All right.
I hope you guys found that useful or interesting. Thanks, John, for bouncing ideas around as always and providing helpful interjections and for mixing and editing the episode. Thanks to Kaylee Law for letting us use his music. Please head over to themasteringshow.com, sign up to the hot list to get email notifications of future episodes. Please tell a friend if you enjoy The Mastering Show and think that they would like it too. That's how I find all of my favorite podcasts, is just by recommendations from other people. So please help spread the word. John, thanks a lot.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thanks for listening.